In 1921, Carl Gustav Jung published Psychological Types, wherein he theorized that there are four principal psychological functions by which we experience the world: sensation, intuition, feeling, and thinking. Further, he said, one of these four functions is dominant most of the time. Jung went on to divide these four psychological functions into two groups. The first group filters, interprets, and even reads between the lines of your sensory inputs, and the second group are your thoughts and feelings about these perceptions. Naturally enough, he called these groups perceiving functions and judging functions. Jung went further by indicating that these four psychological functions operate in two separate modes: outward turning, or extroverted, and inward turning, or introverted. This inward or outward aspect became known as attitude, and applying these contrary attitudes to the four psychological functions resulted in classification of 8 cognitive functions. These functions operate in the external world of behavior, action, people, and things, or the internal world of ideas and reflection. When World War II engulfed the U.S., it prompted a massive wartime mobilization that saw millions of women enter the unknown territory of employment outside of the home. Myers and Briggs were adherents of Jung and felt that they could extrapolate Jung's work and produce a questionnaire identifying roles and jobs best suited to these women. Myers and Briggs suggested that not only do we have a dominate function that we have a preference for, but that we also have an auxiliary function from the opposite functions group, and it out of necessity has the opposite introverted-extroverted attitude. Further, these dominate and auxiliary functions, out of necessity, have attitude and group opposite shadow function. Thus, the core personality is a hierarchy of 4 cognitive functions that steer our inner worlds and influence our external behaviors. The INTP is called an intuitive thinker, or sometimes it is abbreviated N.T., as is reflected by the 2 inner letters of the Myers-Briggs type. For the INTP, the attitude of his judging function is introverted, and the function is often underlined to represent this dominant or preferred mode. The INTP has an intuitive auxiliary perceiving function that has an extroverted attitude, or N.E. The only other possible auxiliary function an intuitive thinking dominant can have, would be extroverted sensing, as you have in the ISTP. The tertiary function is the attitude, and function opposite, cognitive function, of the auxiliary. The inferior function is the attitude, and function opposite, cognitive function, of the dominant, or preferred, function. Given a person's comfort and preference for their dominant function, they often avoid relying upon their inferior function. And often its abilities have to wait maturity to develop enough not to be decidedly a handicap for the individual. In designing the questionnaire of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator psychometric instrument, Myers and Briggs relied upon the 4 aspects of personality an individual should be most acutely aware of: the principal nature of their dominant and auxiliary functions, and how the attitudes of these functions impact an individual's involvement with his or her environment. The INTP has a dominant intuitive thinking function, and this preference demands that the way an INTP can re-energize and re-center is to turn inward to his or her thoughts. This need will make the INTP, and the other people in their lives, aware of an overall introverted nature. The extroverted attitude, belonging to your dominant or auxiliary function, determines if the individual relates to his or her environment as a perceiver, or as a judger. And again, the individual, and those around him or her, will be aware of this outward relationship with the environment. Thus, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, attempts to determine preferences for the 2 internal perceiving and judging dichotomies of intuition versus sensing, and thinking versus feeling, along with the 2 external or behavioral dichotomies of introversion versus extroversion, and perceiving versus judging, the results of which hopefully identify the person's core personality. The combinations result in 16 different types of personalities, and for whatever biological or environmental reasons, INTP is one if not the rarest.